Prime Minister William Pitt, who was the Prime Minister of Great Britain at the time that our Constitution was signed. Necessity, he said, is the plea for every infringement of human freedom. It is the argument of tyrants. It is the creed of slaves. And this afternoon, I wanted to give you a sort of peek through the fingers, horrified look at the legal system that has taken over this country. And most of us, thankfully, never get an opportunity to see what I'm going to tell you about this afternoon. This attitude of necessity is and has always been used by tyrannical governments to increase the law that we have and to try to bring about an ever larger amount of government and involve it in ever more people's lives. And at this point, in many of our lives, we probably either have experienced or know somebody that's experienced some encounter with family law particularly, but at least the law in general. There was a time in America where that generally would not have happened. Most times people could spend their whole lives without ever having anything to do with the law. Maybe they watched something happen. But here and now, in this United States, for example, 500,000 children are right now in the custody of the state in this country. Now that's an astounding number. In my state of Massachusetts, which is essentially has a median population of a little over 6 million, so that's just about 1/50th of the population, there are at any one time 11,000 children in captivity in that state. So this is an amazing thing that's going on in the subterranean ranges of the law that most of us never see and never touch. I'm going to tell you a little bit about that this afternoon. Now, this quote that I gave you from William Pitt, necessity is the plea of the infringement of every human freedom. What's it really mean in practical terms? It means we have a problem, we need a law. And for the last 40 or 50 years, that has been the solution to everything. It has been the solution to all problems, seemingly, whether it's a family problem or some other kind of a problem. We always resort to that first, it seems, rather than try to decentralize and try to find a way to solve the problem with families, communities, churches, and other forms of government. Now, certainly in family law, there's something called divorce. There's something called paternity cases, which more and more cases that go into family law are now becoming. In my city, for example, 70% of the children born are born without two parents in the home. 70%. You cannot hold a culture together with those kinds of numbers. And many of the cities in America, that is a very typical type of a number. Also, family law includes something that we now call domestic abuse restraining orders, or orders of protection, depending on the state that you're in. In my little state, 40,000 of those are issued every year, most of the time on false allegations. It's a dreadful mess. And if you do the numbers, that means that probably the majority of families in the United States have either experienced one of these things that I've just told you about, or knows somebody or has a family member that has. Now, you're probably going to at least run into it in your lifetimes if you haven't already. So part of what you're going to be able to do today is hear about how this works, and I'll conclude with what can we do. And there are some things actually that we can do. Let me give you a couple of examples of the law run amok. In 2001, for those astute at math, that's 10 years ago, I started a case that is still going on now. And it had to do with a monastery. These monks, very poor monks, and they lived in a suburb of Boston, and they had a piece of property. This piece of property was gifted back in the 20s from some mobster who was trying to expunge his guilt to be always used in perpetuity as a church. And unfortunately, all the churches in perpetuity kept giving it to the next church and never recorded the deeds. Can you believe it? This was a disaster when it comes to the law, because our system works only on recorded property instruments, and when this didn't happen, unfortunately it created a situation of chaos that allowed an unscrupulous individual to gain control of the property and literally steal it and sell it right out from under these monks and and take the proceeds for herself. So from about 2001 till now, I've been chasing this money. And I have driven from Springfield, Massachusetts, where I live, to Boston at least 25 times now for various hearings, most of which have ended up just wasting a lot of time. And finally, at the last, we finally got a judgment against this person to get the money back. And then she filed bankruptcy, which stopped everything. And then guess what she did? She, of all people, worked for the state auditor in Massachusetts. Wouldn't you figure? So there's one of these, the pension system in Massachusetts, and I suppose it's like a lot of states, but ours is particularly corrupt. So she took $40,000 of these monks' money and put it in her state pension account. Now, there's another little quirk. Even though I had a judgment sitting here, and it wasn't her money, I couldn't get that money out of the pension system. Why? Because there's also a law, there had to be a law, of course, that says you can't execute a judgment against a state pension. So I had to go to the appeals court. And the appeals court is going, well, yeah, this ain't right, but we have a law. It's going to sit there probably for a long time further before the learned justices can figure out what happened. So there's an example of the law gone amok. I have another case that started 14 years ago. And if you've ever watched The Muppets, you know, there's this two old guys sitting out in the audience, you know, that fuss and fume at each other and make sarcastic remarks. Well, the two guys on both sides of this case are those guys, all right? And they've been fighting over a $150,000 piece of property for 14 years. And we're not even close to that. We haven't even had a trial. Yes, it's possible for the law to go that awry. So I just wanted to tell you. But that's nothing, because that's just money, okay? This is money. The monks have long ago forgiven this thief, thank goodness. The two old guys who want to fight about this property haven't forgiven each other. They're going to be enemies for life. But this is money. What we're going to talk about today are families. We're going to talk about children. And I have watched the sad eyes of children being pried off of their mothers by police at gunpoint because of orders of judges. Perfectly fit parents whose only crime may have been homeschooling, whose only crime may have been they didn't want to be part of the state apparatus in some way. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about some of these cases. We had an opportunity to do an article for the New American. I don't know if some of you saw it a little while back. It was called Separated by the State. And I was very grateful for Gary Benoit publishing this, and it gave some examples of some of the cases that are just so heartbreaking in this matter. So let me introduce myself just very briefly. Since 1993, I've been a lawyer, and I sort of backed inside out getting into family law. And I did that because the first case I took in this area was a child protection case, and I couldn't begin to understand it. It involved a family, perfectly normal family, lived out in a nice rural area, very well-educated people. They had a little girl who was born at 3 pounds, very preemie, lots of problems. They obviously had to have a lot of medical intervention, and as the child grew, they needed to keep that medical intervention. Now, thankfully, her problems began to slightly abate over time, but the mother continued to take this child to doctors. And they came in at gunpoint, as usual, and stole this child and kept this child for over a year because of, here's what they call it, hyper medical intervention. Something to do with over medicalizing this child. Now, rather than say, these doctors maybe could coordinate with each other, which by the way they did, they decided to simply create this utter chaos for this poor family and this poor child who had never been away from her mother and put her in some weird foster home somewhere. Now, all foster homes by any means are not weird. Very recently I represented a minister and his family who had 7 foster children who they adopted, and 2 of their own biological children. One of the foster children, it turned out, had fetal alcohol syndrome, a dreadful thing that hardwires in your mind when you're a little child and causes a lot of problems. And this child had made false allegations against the foster family. They had had over time dozens of foster children in their home and had 7 times passed a social services test to have those other 7 adopted. And yet, all it took was the false allegations of this one young man who had the fetal alcohol syndrome, and everything turned to ashes and to ruin. Thankfully, we got the children back, but it was a real mess. But you can imagine, come with me for just a moment into the living room. When I got involved with this case, all 9 kids sitting around with the parents in the living room, and the little Susie social worker, who, by the way, probably graduated from Wellesley College, had no kids, had no clue. Okay, she's going to come in and save the world. And here we all are, sitting around in a circle, and she's looking and going, She left, and we won. Sometimes that's the way it works, but all too often it isn't. All too often, the court uses an iron fist to ruin families and take children forever. And it's a real mess. So since 1993, I've been doing this sort of thing, and we've been able to get a lot of kids back. Sometimes we don't, and every time it's a heartbreak. Now, I've sort of coined this phrase called the iron triangle of family law, and there's a reason for that. The iron triangle is apparently some sort of an area where terrible wars and drug trafficking occurred. But you can picture this iron triangle of divorce, restraining orders, and child protective services. And if you envision a 3-dimensional triangle, you add one more point, and that's criminal violations that come out of this stuff, which is not uncommon at all. Adding a 4th point, you've got this 3-dimensional triangle with 4 disastrous things. It is not uncommon for an unscrupulous attorney, I repeat myself, to say to a litigant when they start a divorce, okay, go get a restraining order, call the Department of Children and Families, accuse them of assault, and then file the divorce. And now you've got the iron triangle. And it operates again and again and again in the United States. And some of you probably have actually had friends, neighbors, or relatives that have had this happen to them, or at least some variation of that. So how did this all come about? It's necessity. Back in the days of the thrice cursed President Nixon, a senator who may be more than thrice cursed by the name of Walter Mondale, you may remember him, 1974, those heady days. They said, we have a problem, we gotta pass a law. The problem was child abuse. And so, this is what I learned, by the way, from the Birch Society. And I had no idea until I became part of the Birch Society why it happened this way. But what they taught me is this: they agitate from below and they agitate from above. And this is how so many of these sort of social problems get addressed by laws. So they bring in all sorts of pathetic creatures in to talk about child abuse at congressional hearings. They have all the professional people from above giving all sorts of learned, erudite information to the captive media. And then everybody becomes part of the clamoring then. So now we all believe that there's a problem and we need a law. Now certainly there was a problem, but I'm going to tell you how they solved it. And if you had to figure out a way to solve this problem, you could not have figured out a worse way than they figured out. I'm going to tell you about what they decided to do. They put a law together called Child Abuse and Prevention Treatment Act. The acronym is CAPTA. And what it did is it created, by law, if you wanted the federal goodies, and this is where Birch Society has really helped us understand this whole process. The federal government doesn't say, you have to take this money and you have to structure your state agency this way. But if you will set up a state agency to do the following things, A, B, and C, we'll give you boatloads of cash. And so they do, of course, as fast as they possibly can set up the agency to do what they're told and start collecting the cash. In fact, it is so lucrative that the Arthur Anderson Consulting Company, which is now out of business because of their unscrupulous practices, was centered in Boston, was hired by the state of Massachusetts for $4 million to figure out ways to maximize the return and get all of the various goodies at the federal level that they could get from their state child protection operation. It's about the money. It's all about the Benjamins, as they say. So here's what they do. They first set up something called a snitch network. Now, the snitch network has a nicer name than that, but it really is nothing more than the Committees for the Defense of the Revolution in Cuba. It is a snitch network that's in, they call it a hotline. But if you see some suspected child abuse, you call up the hotline and you say, we have suspected child abuse. They then send an agent out, again, Susie, social worker with no clue, no training, a 23-year-old graduate of Wellesley who's going to save the world. They come into your house, and here is the legal standard that they go. Reasonable cause to believe. Now, what does that mean? Nothing. The most high legal standard that anybody uses in this country is called beyond a reasonable doubt. That is the criminal standard of proof. If the state wants to prove a case, they have to show beyond a reasonable doubt that the accused did the crime. Then there's one below that called clear and convincing evidence. And then there's one below that called the preponderance of the evidence, which you could say is 51%. Then there's one below that, and that is probable cause. That's what it takes to arrest or indict somebody. But reasonable cause to believe is below that. It's ankle deep. It is all it means is somebody may have done something. When the investigator makes the determination that this has happened, that person's name goes on a registry of child abusers for 75 years, and it cannot be removed. There is a huge registry out there most of us don't know about, and probably a whole lot of people in this room are on it and don't even know it. It's really a sad thing, because then when you go to get employed as a daycare worker, a police officer, a teacher, or anything else that has to do with children, bus driver, you're going to find out just how dangerous this registry is because of one very ill-equipped social worker who doesn't know how to do investigations. Now, then what happens is this. They make a determination whether to go in and take the children or not take the children. If they take the children, they put them in a warehouse of some sort, either with a foster family or in a group home. And then a court proceeding starts. You have in most states 72 hours to have a hearing where the parents have an opportunity to come in and counter this allegation that they're unfit parents. Now, how in 72 hours are you going to hire a lawyer and prepare a case? You can't, and they don't, and therefore they keep the kids. And it usually is at least a year. So this is not a good situation. I want to tell you about a couple of the cases that I've seen where this goes into practice. A film producer in Boston who's married and has 5 little children in a very expensive suburb of Boston went across the street to the CVS. And they're from very northern European stock, and many people in northern Europe have some difficulty with possible nutrient absorption. And so one of their kids literally fainted when they were over in the CVS, and they did not realize she had some sort of a calcium deficiency because of it was just genetic. So squad cars aplenty came. They hauled this child over to the hospital, and the father went in the ambulance, and 12 hours later, they did testing on this child and the family, found out that this particular calcium deficiency was prevalent in the family as well as the child. But when they went to leave, they couldn't leave. Remember that Hotel California, you can check out anytime you want, but you can never leave. And this is what the medical profession is now reduced to. They have now become an adjunct, a hand, a claw of the police state in the child protection area. And they were told, do not let these parents leave. This child could not leave, and they hauled her away, put her into custody, and it took about 8 months to get all 5 children back. Now, because one child fainted who had a calcium deficiency, 5 children were taken. And now keep in mind, these were children who were homeschooled. Every wall in their apartment was lined with books, computers, everything. This is an incredibly smart bunch of kids who were probably 7 grade levels ahead of all of their peers. And they hauled them off and put them with an immigrant family who could barely speak English. And it was just a very, very strange situation. We eventually got them back. So this is the sort of thing that happens all the time. And nobody really stops to think whether this is going to be helpful. So here's why it happens. Because CAPTA, this law that Mr. Mondale got passed in the Congress and that President Nixon signed, allocates 90% of the funds for child warehousing or foster care. 10% of the money goes to helping keep families intact. So guess what they do? They put the kids in foster homes because that's where the big reimbursement is. Then they do something else. They drug the children. The commissioner of child kidnapping in Massachusetts said that they drug 88% of the children that they take in that state. And I heard that personally at a hearing where he was under oath stating this to a House subcommittee. That's a really discouraging number. Now, could that many children be medically, and these are psychotropic drugs. These are not medically necessary drugs. These are antipsychotic drugs primarily. And children shouldn't even be taking them in the first place, never mind 88% of them. So this is a terrible situation. So what can we do about this kind of thing happening? I've thought a lot about this because we all we come to these conferences and we hear these terrible things and we wonder, well, what can be done? Can something be done? Well, I wanted to talk about the concept of the remnant a little bit. There are things we can do. The Birch Society is a remnant. If you recollect back in the days of Elijah, he slew the 400 prophets of Baal, and then he sat down under a tree and he was really tired. And he began to lament after a while, where's all the people? Where are the faithful people? Am I alone? Is there anybody else? And we see this also in the ministry of Jesus. He feeds 5,000 people. And then he begins to preach a sermon that wasn't too pleasant about how you really had to be committed if you were going to be one of his followers. And he looks around, and the only people left are the 12. And he goes, are you guys going to leave me too? Frankly, what are we going to do? I think what we're going to do is do what we're doing now, and we've got to stop being so anxious. Painful as that is, we are the remnant. There is always going to be a remnant. God told Elijah there are 7,000 people who have not bowed their knee to Baal. And that may be all there was. Israel might have been a few million at that time, and there was 7,000 out of those number of people who had not compromised. In any group who is trying to preserve the truth, who is trying to preserve a right way of thinking. And frankly, the Birch Society has always stood for, obviously, limited government, has stood for honoring God, and has stood for a country that's based on families and communities and a wholesome life. Now, strangely enough, have you ever noticed how our organization is vilified for that? I hear it all the time. People just mock. And you know, particularly the lefty-leaning sorts of attorneys that I deal with. I mean, when they use the Birch Society, they spit it out as an epithet. And I say, well, excuse me, but, and then I'll tell them what we're really about. And at the core, who could disagree with us in essence? But they do. They do because what they really want is they want what William Pitt was talking about. What they really want is that big government. What they really want is the government to solve the problems, to feed the hungry and do all the things that it does. Independence and responsibility is a very scary thing. And the people in this room, this remnant, are the ones that are at odds with that sort of thinking. So, obviously, we can do all the traditional things we try to do. And the Birch Society has taken, I think, just the right posture. We aggressively educate. We try to help at least ourselves and those whom we speak with about these things to be part of that remnant and teach them what it means to be part of that remnant. And I think, frankly, that's what we are about and what we can do. And that we can really not expect this ever to become a mass movement. We can expect it to become a bigger movement, a more fruitful movement, and a more influential one. But it will never be the dominant theory. We dream of that. We yearn for that. We want that. But I don't think it's ever going to be that. I don't think it ever could be that. But what we can do is we can take what we know and we can help people to become aware of the destructive power of this necessity. There ought to be a law. And we can talk to them about what these laws do. And all of us in this room have seen it, whether I've seen it particularly in family law, but all of us have seen it in some ways. This is not working. And I think more and more people are starting to see it. In a strange and perverse way, having the current federal administration, which has gone so over the top and added so much to the laws and been so brazen about increasing the size and scope and oppressiveness of government, has woken up yet another whole group of people. As many are probably aware, gun sales have soared. That's at least an objective measure as to why and how this has happened. So frankly, there was this, when I was in law school, they make you read a lot of cases there. And one of the great judges, we all loved his name, best judge name ever, Judge Learned Hand. Of course, we would always go. So Judge Learned Hand, he was a New York judge, and he was a very complex figure. I never could really figure out what he stood for, but he said this about liberty. Liberty lies in the hearts of men and women. When it dies there, no constitution, no law, and no court can save it. And that's true. That's why the Birch Society is doing what it's doing. Because, frankly, does anybody in this room need to be told not to go steal their neighbor's stuff? Probably not. Why? Because it's in your heart. You're just not going to go do it. Okay? You don't need to do it. You don't need to be told not to do it. The law is for those outliers. The law is for those who don't want to respect their own conscience and respect the law of nature and nature's God. So either we want that or we not as a nation. The Birch Society is really in the vanguard of trying to bring us back to where we need to be. There's an appreciable number of our fellow citizens, however, who do not agree with us. But of those who may, those are the ones we need to speak with. Frankly, there's a lot of people who just are never going to agree with us and who are going to be in that great majority who don't question this stuff and say, okay, if it's the government, it must be right. So I think what we have to do is we have to figure out our own ways to flee this situation as much as we can and help others to see what they need to do. Now, there's a couple other cases that I wanted to tell you about before I close here. When I go into the juvenile court, the only thing I can think of is to call it the Hall of Pain, because lined up all along these long halls are parents full of heartbreak and pain. And one of the interesting pictures that we had in this article in the New American was a couple of twins, and the great learned judge thought he was literally splitting the baby. And probably many of you can't see it, but if you'd seen this article, here's the father with the two kids, and here's the cops hauling one kid this way and the cops hauling the other kid that way, screaming and crying at the top of their lungs. These are the things I see every day. And I had an epiphany myself. I came to the point where I said, am I doing any good at all? Is this even worth fighting? Can I fight? I mean, look what's happening here. I can't even stop this stuff from happening sometimes. And I had to decide, am I going to go cynical, or am I going to remain optimistic because God is still in heaven and we still have an opportunity to fight these things? And there's still a whole room full of people here who agree that we need to fight these things. Being at a place like this for me is an incredible encouragement to keep trying, because not everybody has bowed their knee to Baal, and there is a way to keep fighting. In the juvenile court, what's happening now is going the other direction, though. we have, these are secret courts, what we might want to call star chamber types of courts. There is no jury, there's no press, there's no public, and there's absolutely no accountability. So when parents want to sue the social workers who do this or the judges who do this sort of thing, they're really not allowed to do it. They have immunity. And this judicial immunity extends to social workers, to guardians, to all kinds of people involved in the system. So that is not the way we're ever going to win this. In other words, you can't use the system to get the system. The system will never allow itself to be used that way. The system does just fine processing criminals. They come in one door, they go out. Okay, it's set up for that. It is not set up for what it is now doing, and that is taking children or dealing with families, very complex, nuanced, heartbreaking family situations. It's just not suitable. So I'm hoping that at least everybody in this room, having been somewhat enlightened by what's going on, will do your own looking, your own research, and find out what's going on in your state to be at least an aware fighter to oppose the sort of thing that's going on. And to this hotline, for example, I'd meant to say this earlier, but these hotlines across the United States, there are 3 million calls to these snitch network hotlines every year in the United States. Can you imagine that? 3 million calls, and that's the pipeline in. And they also have what are called reporting statutes, which require everybody that's ever in touch with a child, for example, a doctor, a school teacher, a guidance counselor, a policeman, or anybody else, to make these reports, and that's why there are so many. And so the whole system is really set up as a sort of a police state apparatus. And I want you to be aware of this so that when you see it happening, you can be prepared to stop it. We still have at least small smatterings of our Fourth Amendment left. The Fourth Amendment is the one that says you cannot go into a person's home and seize their person or property or papers without a warrant. So if this happens to you, you really want to at least try to put the brakes on it as much as possible with the First Amendment. And let me leave you with this. Even though we have this iron triangle of family law, we still have a remnant, and there still are people fighting out there to try to stop it. And I appreciate so much that the Birch Society really is in the vanguard, mocked or not. Actually, if we weren't being mocked, we probably wouldn't be the remnant, because the remnant is always mocked. So let's not lose heart. Let's continue to fight this stuff and be aware of what's going on in this matter, this grave matter that's going on in our country. And don't cede it to the enemy. Really do join me in trying to help fight back. Thanks.